After studying this module, you shall be able to 1. Learn the concept of public expenditure and its main objectives. 2. Distinguish between public and private goods, public expenditure and private expenditure. 3. Study the pure theory of public expenditure. 4. Understand the structure and growth of public expenditure. The spending done by the government of a country on the collective needs of the citizens is called public expenditure. The government incurs this expenditure to provide the goods and services that the competitive market would not be willing to provide. Public expenditure for goods and services can be considered as a means of supplying services in appreciable quantity that would not have been possible through the market. In practice, the government needs to spend in order to run the government to serve the society and protect the people from foreign aggression. Public expenditure shows the decision of the Parliament and other independent executive bodies for the scope of public expenses. It is measured with respect to the public expenses made by the government in the previous year or last financial interval. Public expenditure is not merely a financial mechanism, but it also aims at securing social objectives. The major objectives of public expenditure include administration of law, order and justice, maintenance of police force, army and provision for defense goods, public administration, servicing of public debt, development of industries, transport and communication, provision of public health, healthcare and education, promotion of socio-economic welfare of the citizens. Let us now start with understanding the difference between public and private expenditure. It is well acknowledged that there is a similarity between public and private expenditure. Neither public nor the private individual likes to incur expenditure without any return. Both public as well as the private expenditure possesses the element of flexibility. Also, in each case, there can be more than one way of raising additional resources. Contrary to this, there are also points of difference between the two. The main points of difference between public and private expenditure can be summarized as follows. Public expenditure is a type of spending usually done by the firms in the public sector or government organizations. Examples include building of schools, dams, public and merit goods, whereas private expenditure are carried out by firms in the private sector of an economy who have their main motive as profit. Examples of these expenditure includes setting up a factory or expansion of a profitable outlet. Public expenditure is financed by the taxpayer, whereas a private expenditure is financed by an individual or a group of investors aiming generally to make a profit. Now, we will first understand different types of goods. The difference between national defense and a burger, as a layman would see, is that the former is free while the latter has a price. But this is not the only difference. National defense is an example of public good, whereas a burger is a private good, public good. Samuelson defines a public good as one which all enjoy in common, in the sense that each individual's consumption of such a good leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. In short, a public good is non-rival in consumption. Another defining feature of public good is that of non-excludability, which means that to prevent anyone from consuming the good is either very expensive or impossible. Private good. Private goods are rival in consumption, in the sense that if one individual consumes a good, the same good cannot be consumed by another person. They also possess the property of excludability, which means that if one individual buys a good, it gives him or her the right over it, and the same good cannot be purchased by another person. The provision of public goods through the market is inefficient because they possess the property of non-excludability, and if people cannot be excluded, it will deprive the firms of their profits. Hence, there is no incentive for the private firms to provide these goods. As a result, the government has to step in for the provision of these goods. Let us now discuss the pure theory of public expenditure. The pure theory of public expenditure was given by Paul A. Samuelson, though the tradition goes back to Italian and Austrian writers who are responsible for the revival of the benefit approach. Their main concern was the presentation of efficient resource allocation and optimal provision of public goods. The next topic of discussion is how to determine the optimum provision of public goods. Private goods are provided on the basis of preferences revealed by individuals in the market. But in the case of public goods, individual preferences are not known. So, public goods cannot be provided by private enterprise and hence are provided collectively. How can the market principle then be applied to the determination of the optimal provision of financing of public goods? One important characteristic as described by the definition of public goods is that they are non-rival in consumption, meaning the consumption of the good by one individual does not reduce the benefits derived by all other individuals from the same good. Therefore, one resultant implication of this characteristic is that when finding out the aggregate demand for the good, individuals' demand curves must be added vertically rather than horizontally, as in the case of private goods. Consider the supply and demand curve for private and public goods as shown in the figure. Figure 1, aggregate demand in case of private and public good. Source: John Gillis and Philip Jones, 1998. Public Finance and Public Choice. Part A. Let DA and DB be the demand of the individuals A and B respectively. MC is the marginal cost of production. The aggregate demand curve is found by simply adding the quantity demanded by each individual at given price. If producers price at the marginal cost, then each individual will consume the good when the marginal benefit from doing so exceeds the price. Hence, dA plus B is the aggregate demand curve at price B. At this price, quantity demanded by the individual A is QA. Quantity demanded by individual B is QB. And total market demand is QA plus B. That is, MC is equal to P is equal to MBA is equal to MBB. Part B. Let DAs and DBs be the demands of individuals A and B respectively. MC is the marginal cost of production. Since the good is public, each individual can consume the same quantity. The aggregate demand curve in this case is found by adding the price of that each individual is willing to pay for a given quantity of the good. Therefore, D dash A plus B is the aggregate demand curve for the public good. For quantity Q of the public good, TA is the price paid by A, TB is the price paid by B, and P is the price of the public good. The optimality condition in this case becomes MC is equal to MBA plus MBB. As can be clearly seen from the discussion, the aggregate demand curve in the case of private good is found by horizontally adding the individual demand curves, whereas in the case of public good, the aggregate demand curve is found by vertical summation of the individual demand curves. The summation in case of private good is over quantity at any price, whereas in the case of the public good, the summation is over price at any quantity. The question now is, what combination of private and public goods should be produced? Some important terms need to be discussed in order to answer the above question. 1. Transformation curve. It is a graphical representation of the maximum amount of one good or service that an economy can produce by reducing production of other goods or services and transferring the resources saved to the production of the former good. Let us take the case of two commodity world. An economy is capable of building and equipping 50 hospitals if it does not build any schools, or 80 schools if it builds no hospitals. Either of these combinations would be a point on the transformation curve, which can be plotted on a graph with the number of hospitals built and equipped on one axis and the number of schools on the other, as shown in the figure below. The transformation curve traces the number of schools that can be built and equipped using the resources required for any given level of hospital building. Marginal rate of transformation. The marginal rate of transformation is the rate at which one good must be sacrificed in order to produce a single extra unit or marginal unit of other good, assuming that both goods require the same scarce inputs. The absolute value of the slope of the transformation curves gives the marginal rate of transformation. Pareto optimality. It is the state of an economy in which no one can be made better off without someone being made worse off. For this to be the case, three types of efficiency must hold. A. Productive efficiency, in which the output of the economy is being produced at the lowest cost. B. Allocative efficiency, in which resources are being allocated to the production of the goods and services the society most values. And C. Distributional efficiency, in which output is distributed in such a way that consumers would not wish, given their disposable income and market prices, to spend these incomes in any different way. Now consider the diagram. In the figure, the transformation curve TT shows the production possibilities of the economy for private and public good. The slope of the transformation curve gives the marginal rate of transformation. Pareto optimality requires that the economy operates at a point where it is impossible to make one individual better off without making another individual worse off. Samuelson's approach is to decide just how well off one individual is going to be, and then to search for that combination of private and public good which makes the other individuals as well off as possible. In this way, he is interpreting the requirements of Pareto optimality as making any individuals as well off as possible, provided that the other individual is made no worse off than some reference level of welfare. In figure B and C, the indifference curve maps are shown for individuals A and B. A is held on the indifference curve I to A, and in this way A's level of welfare is fixed. Now, each individual must consume the same amount of public good. The indifference curve I to A shows the alternative quantities of private and public good that keeps A on the fixed level of welfare. Therefore, when A consumes OG of public good, he will also consume G1 of the private good, and B would similarly be able to consume OG of public good and G2 minus G1 of the private good if the economy operated efficiently. Repeating the process for every possible output of the public good produces a curve CC in part C. This curve is a set of consumption possibilities available to individual B, assuming that A is kept on I to A. This curve has been derived by deducting I to A from TT. Now the problem is to find out that output level for private and public goods which maximizes the welfare of individual B. This is shown by the tangency point between I3B and the curve CC. It is clear that at point 3 in part C, the tangency has been found by subtracting at OG the marginal rate of substitution for individual A from MRT and then equating the MRS of individual B to the slope of CC, which is given by MRT minus MRS A. Therefore, the Pareto optimality condition in an economy that produces public and private good becomes MRS B is equal to MRT minus MRS A, or MRT is equal to MRS A plus MRS B. The above discussion gives the conclusion that Pareto optimality in an economy producing both public and private goods depends only on the marginal rate of transformation and the marginal rate of substitution between the two goods for all the individuals. This approach is obviously individualistic as it focuses on the marginal rate of substitution of the individuals. However, would individuals' preference be the same as the preferences revealed in the choices between good in the private sector? Com 1956 offers this criticism as a consideration in determining the optimal provision of public goods. Musgrave and Musgrave 1989 argue that Samuelson's approach would be improved if the decision on the correct income distribution could be separated further from the efficiency conditions in the analysis. It is also worth considering that the efficiency conditions involve different MRS for individuals, suggesting that no single common tax price is appropriate for all. This increases the problem of preference revelation. Now we will discuss the structure of public expenditure. Classification of public expenditure refers to arranging various components of public expenditure on a systematic, scientific and economic basis from which one is enabled to distinguish between the nature and effects of different kinds of public expenditure. In order to make it more useful and effective, the classification should not be formal. It must always have some meaningful and realistic public expenditure to reveal the effects and incidence of various kinds of expenditures and also focus on the relative importance which has been given to each head of expenditure. It is also significant in a democratic country as the people need to know whether the public expenditure is appropriately spent or is used wasteful purposes or is misappropriated. Most of the economists believe that the basis for classification should not be absolute, but it should be relative to the purpose for which classification is taken up. According to R.N. Bhargava, a good classification must satisfy two tests as follows. 1. The classes should be mutually exclusive so that the idea can be allocated to one class only. This will make the classification exact. 2. The basis of classification should be a necessary attribute of the object classified. This will make it scientific and sensible. Many classifications have been given by economists, and each classification is relative to the need for which it was given. Some of the classifications have laid emphasis on benefit received by the individuals, and others have emphasized on the functions of the government. We are following in this lesson the classification adopted by the Government of India: plan and non-plan expenditure. India has adopted economic planning as a strategy for economic development. The Government of India expenditure is classified as plan and non-plan expenditure. Plan expenditure is spent on government programs and flagship schemes, while non-plan expenditure includes spending on defense, subsidies, and some devolutions to the states. Plan expenditure comprises current development and investment outlays that arise due to proposals in the current plan. Non-plan expenditure is the one which government is obliged to do, that is, the estimated expenditure provided in the budget for spending during the year on routine functioning of the government. It includes both development and non-development expenditure. Part of this expenditure is obligatory, like defense, police, etc. Expenditure on maintenance of assets of the previous plan is called non-plan expenditure in current plan. Revenue and capital expenditure. The United Nations prepared a manual for economic and functional classification of government transactions in 1958 for functional and economic classification of their budgets. Budget is divided in two heads, revenue and capital, and therefore both receipts and expenditures are divided in two heads of revenue and capital. If we see this in case of India, in India, revenue expenditure includes all current expenditure on administration, defense, and public commercial undertakings like railways, post and telegraph, etc. Capital expenditure consists of all capital transactions including defense and capital transactions of public commercial undertakings. In India, also such classification of the government's budgetary transactions to the central budget was being followed since 1957-58. In India, revenue expenditures includes all current expenditure on administration, defense, and public commercial undertakings like railways, post and telegraphs, grants in aid, while capital expenditure consists of all capital transactions. Now we will discuss the growth of public expenditure. Public expenditure has increased manifold in the recent past, and it continues to be exhibiting an increasing trend in almost all countries of the world. In the words of C.C. Flem, public expenditure grows because and as public activities increase. This increase is both extensive and intensive. Government in every branch, central, intermediate, and local, are constantly assuming new work or duties and are constantly performing the older functions and in turn newer ones also on an ever larger scale. In India also, public expenditure has been increasing over time. Let us now discuss the reasons for the growth. 1. Growing population. An increase in the population calls for increase in public expenses. Population growth has made it necessary for governments of most countries to spend increasing amounts on health, education, social security, subsidy, etc. 2. Inflation. Inflation would mean that the government is forced to spend more money in providing essential goods to the public. Hence, the public expenditure would increase. 3. Urbanization. Urbanization has increased the dependence of people on the government for basic requirements such as drinking water, sanitation, etc. It has also led to the migration of labor from rural areas that end up living in slums. The government has to take the responsibility of these people and provide them with the basic requirements. 4. Interest payments. Government borrowing has been on an increase. As a result, the government has to incur large interest payments, resulting in an increase in public expenditure. Fifthly, economic development. In less developed countries, the government has to take the responsibility of achieving rapid economic development because the private sector is not willing to take up huge investments. This leads to an increase in the public expenditure. Sixthly, social security measures. The government provides social security measures for the welfare of the people, which increases its expenditure. It provides measures such as old age pensions, free education, medical facilities, public works and relief programs, etc. Seventhly, defense expenditure. The defense expenditure has increased over the years. It is essential because it reduces the possibility of external threats. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Public expenditure is the expenditure incurred by the government of a country on the collective needs of its citizens. These collective or public goods would not be provided by private enterprise because of the lack of profit incentives. The aggregate demand in case of private goods is determined by the horizontal summation of individual demands at a given price, whereas the aggregate demand in case of public goods is given by the vertical summation of the individual prices that each individual is willing to pay for the provision of a given quantity of public good. The pure theory of public expenditure given by Samuelson provides the optimality condition in an economy that produces public and private goods. Public expenditure has been classified into planned and non-planned expenditure and revenue and capital expenditure. The public expenditure has been increasing over the years, and the reasons for the growth of public expenditure include growing population, inflation, urbanization, interest payments, economic development, social security measures and increase in defense expenditure.